The sun had just begun to crawl over the edge of the canyon, casting gold and crimson light across the barren New Mexico plains. Every morning, John Callahan stood on his porch, staring into that same horizon, waiting for something that never came. For 15 years, he'd been alone on that land. Alone with the wind, the cattle, and the ghosts of his past. Once, his ranch had been full of life, laughter, horses, his wife Mary hanging laundry while their son ran barefoot through the dust. But fever took them both in a single cruel winter, and since then, John spoke to no one but his horse and the old dog that lay under the porch. People in town called him the Lone Rancher. Some said he'd lost his mind talking to the wind. Others said he'd made peace with his loneliness. John didn't care either way. He was alive because the land still needed working, and that was reason enough. But everything changed one afternoon when a storm rolled out of nowhere. Dark clouds gathered, thunder cracked, and John rode out to bring in the cattle before the rain turned the valley into a swamp. That's when he saw her, a figure in the distance, stumbling through the storm. She was tall, much taller than any woman John had ever seen. Broad shoulders, strong arms, and a gaze that could cut through the rain. Wrapped in soaked leather and wearing a torn buckskin cloak, she looked like a warrior dragged straight out of the old Apache wars. When John rode closer, she lifted a rifle. "Don't come closer," she warned in a voice rough as gravel. "I don't need your help." John stopped his horse and raised both hands. "Ma'am, you'll drown out here before sundown. Storm's getting worse. My ranch is 3 miles that way." Her eyes narrowed. "White man's ranch." He nodded. "Ain't much of one anymore, but it's dry and there's coffee." She hesitated. Rain poured down her face, washing streaks of mud from her cheekbones. Finally, she lowered her rifle and muttered, "Lead the way." That's how it started. Her name was Nayeli, a widow of the Chiricahua Apache. Her husband had been killed years ago by soldiers near the border, and she'd been wandering ever since, carrying his ashes in a leather pouch. She was looking for the place where he'd fallen. She wanted to bury him where the earth could remember his name. John gave her shelter that night. She refused his food, sitting silent by the fire, her eyes always watching the door. The storm raged for 2 days, and in that time the quiet of the house shifted. It had been silent for so long, but now there were footsteps that weren't his. The sound of firewood breaking, the low hum of a woman's voice in Apache. When the rain cleared, John figured she'd leave. But instead she said, "You will take me to the borderlands. I need a man who knows this land. You owe this earth your service, and I will tell you when your debt is paid." John blinked. "Hold on, lady, I'm not." But she interrupted sharply. "You saved me from the storm. Now you serve me until I find the place of my husband." John almost laughed, but there was something in her tone, something commanding and fierce, that made him hesitate. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe guilt, but he agreed. From that day on, the Lone Rancher wasn't alone anymore. Nayeli worked like a force of nature. She rose before dawn, chopped wood like it was nothing, and ordered John around like he was her hired hand. "Fix the fence," she'd bark. "Fetch water. Don't talk so much." And John, a man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in a decade, found himself obeying her without complaint. Something about her presence made the land feel alive again. When she sang old songs in Apache, even the cattle grew calm. When she worked beside him in the fields, he could feel his heart beating the way it used to when Mary was still alive. One morning, as he brought her coffee, she asked without looking up, "Why do you stay alone here?" He paused. "Because everything I had died here. The land's all I got left." She stared into the horizon. "The land remembers, but it doesn't care. You must teach it to care again." He didn't understand what she meant, not yet. Weeks passed. Together they traveled south across dry plains and rocky mesas. She led the way, following signs only she could see: the bend of a river, the cry of an eagle, the shape of the hills. At night, they camped by the fire. John listened to her stories of the old days when the Apache ruled the desert, when her husband hunted mountain lions and sang to the stars. She told him how he'd been betrayed by men wearing blue coats, how he'd fallen protecting his people. He was tall, she said softly, and he believed the spirits would carry him home, but the soldiers burned his body. I only found ashes. Her voice cracked then, the first time he'd heard pain in it. John wanted to say something, but words felt small beside her grief. So he just added more wood to the fire and sat close, their silence speaking louder than any comfort he could offer. By the time they reached the borderlands, something inside John had changed. He wasn't the same man who stared at empty fields each morning. He'd learned to laugh again, small, rough laughs that surprised even him. And Nayeli, the giant Apache widow who once barked orders at him, had softened too. She still led, still commanded, but there was warmth in her eyes now. On their final night, she stopped by a canyon. The wind howled like the voices of the dead. "This is the place," she said quietly. "Here he fell." She knelt, opened the pouch of ashes, and scattered them into the wind. For a moment, John swore he saw the shape of a warrior rise in the dust before disappearing into the stars. She whispered something in Apache, a prayer, and stood. When she turned to him, tears streaked her cheeks. "My husband is home now." John nodded. "You want me to take you back north?" She shook her head. "No, now you must serve the land again. It still remembers you." He smiled faintly. "And you, where will you go?" She looked toward the mountains. "Where the spirits tell me, but maybe," she hesitated, "maybe I will come back when the snow melts." Spring came late that year. The ranch was blooming again, grass growing where dust had ruled for years. John built a new fence, fixed the roof, even started raising colts again. The neighbors in town whispered that the lone rancher had found new life.